Go ahead.
For
Yep.
coming by. Hopefully, you guys will learn some stuff today. And,
All right, so we're going to get things started here. So, everybody, my name's Mike. This is Alex and Sam. So, we all fish locally around here, Western Shore, Eastern Shore, perch, pickerel, and whatnot. And our main goal today is to kind of go over three main things. So, we really want to go over where to actually catch these perch and pickerel. So, we're going to go through some spots today. A lot of what we're going to do is probably going to be going over rigs and then the techniques with them. At the end, we're going to finish up with line, tackle, all that kind of stuff. We're going to definitely take questions at the end. We're going to have all this stuff up here. We're going to hang out for a good while afterwards as well. So if you have specific questions and things, we'll go ahead and answer all of those at one time. It's also, we don't have microphones, obviously, so some of you in the back, as we talk, if we start getting too low, you can't hear us, just raise your hand and we'll try and be much better about it. So that's how we're going to go at that. So we're actually going to start with pickerel first. And we're going to go over some of the rigs and then we're going to go over some of the spots. So we really want to just hop right into it and talk about bait fishing for pickerel. It's kind of a lot of people use bait, but it's almost primarily just minnows. And really that is your main bait for them. So really our main minnow rigs that we're using out there are going to usually be minnows tipped on some sort of an actual lure. So very rarely do we really fish minnows on plain hooks, plain bottom rigs, this and that. It's usually still a cast and retrieve. For me, the reason I usually like using minnows is you get a lot of action that they produce themselves without you doing anything. Right. So you get these cold water bites like we've had because the water temperature is cold, and you can see plain and simple, like the fish is right there and you're moving your lure and he's kind of like, maybe I'll come. So it's great to have something that even stationary is still moving. This is a 13 Tony here, which you can see on my big camera. This is probably my favorite lure to use with minnows. So the Tony spoon in general has really wide flanges on it as opposed to like a Nungusser spoon. It gives it a lot of wobble. So it's not a spin spoon, it's a wobble spoon. Very little action, very little retrieve. With a minnow, it's going crazy. So usually it's a cast, I'm letting it sink down, and I'm doing a very slow retrieve. And I'm just lightly letting it jig. And so again, my whole goal is to hardly retrieve and hope that they catch up to it and start taking it. This is the exact same thing we use too for minnows as well. Depending on where I am, so there are a lot of times you're just in thin water, there's a lot of water moving, there's hard drop-offs. A lot of times I will tandem this, kind of like, we have one of those rigs out here, kind of like this shad dart rig you see here, but I'll drop the spoon off the back and I'll use the shad dart as a weight. Now, given I usually am putting a minnow on there because why not add extra bait to the rig, but I kind of use that as extra weight as opposed to using something like split shot or something like that. So those are kind of our go-to rigs on the pickerel stuff there. So Sammy, I know you were actually saying that you have, where's that spinner rig you had that you wanted to show?
Spinner rig?
The curl tail.
Oh. So what I'll do a lot of times in that same situation, I'm going to be fishing a lure when I need to get that bait. Anytime you want to fish bait, I like fishing it on a little bucktail. This one in particular is a VMC one. This is a 1/8 ounce. And I'm fishing it the same way. I'm letting it get down. I'm barely working it up off of the bottom really, really slowly. And I'll just tip that with any regular bullhead minnow. And it's really hard to beat. That water is super cold. Like this week, for instance, yesterday that ice just kind of thinned out in a lot of spots, and this really did work well for us.
Yeah. And one thing I want to add to this for one of my personal ways to rig a minnow, especially in, I'm going to say like slower moving water areas, it's actually a slip bobber. And the reason why I want to use a slip bobber, or why I personally like to use a slip bobber with a shad dart or any kind of jig you want, normally I put a 1/16, nothing too crazy. And the reason why is because, like they were talking about moving it, like a steady retrieve. Actually, with a slip bobber, what it's doing is you can actually let it sit and just pull the line. And this bobber is going to sit on the same spot. And as you're moving the line, it's going through the bobber, it's actually vertical jigging it. So this bobber is going to sit there, And this little jig with the minnow, you know, the minnow's doing the side-to-side action, and you're pulling it up and down. So it's something different, a different look, something that, you know, those fish don't see too often. So that's one of those techniques I like to use for pickerel, anything in particular, honestly.
Yeah.
All you're doing is upsizing your jigs or your bobber for whatever species you're fishing. But that's one of like my classic go-to bait, you know, setups.
And it's a great way to adjust your rig too. So I think like pickerel aren't necessarily they don't necessarily, you know, stay in one area or anything, but they are kind of that way. And a lot of times once you have them hit or you get one on the line and you lose it, you're not getting a second strike on that lure. Like, you have to change your lure, you have to change your retrieve. So that's a really good way after you basically missed a fish, which I do all the time on those sort of rigs, or you lose it, to actually get the fish to hit again, because again, a lot of times they will just sit there kind of dormantly and not hitting anymore. So anyway, let's move on from the bait and get into some of your other rigs we got going on.
Yeah, so primarily, my favorite way to do it is just to throw soft plastics. I think there's so many different options out there that you really can't go wrong with them. There's paddle tails, curly tails, and those are going to be your two most popular kinds, a 4-inch paddle tail and then a 3 to 4-inch curly tail grub. And these ones in particular are just rigged up on a small 1/8 of an ounce jig head. Another option you can do is rig them weedless anytime you're in, you know, really, really heavy cover. I prefer to rig them with the exposed hook because I think my hookups are way better. But there's situations where you do need to use a weedless hook. So this one here is just a simple 3/0 1/8 of an ounce. And they're super simple to rig. You'll just go in here through the nose, screw it on.
And I think you'll see this with all the rigs we have there. The particular jig heads we're using are all long shanked.
Yes.
So short strikes are big this time of year. You know, you're trying to throw a little bit bigger profile baits out there, but if you use a lot of standard jig heads, you're going to get tons and tons of short strikes. So you'll notice that all of these here are much longer shanks, but lightweight. So one of those are the new Berkeley ones that have them. One of my new favorite ones are the Blue Water Candy just came out with, are these little 1/8 ounce. So very lightweight. You know, it's not going to sink too far, but again, really long shank helps hook up a lot more on those.
So back into these two different styles. There's I'm going to fish the curly tail anytime I need to fish it a little bit quicker. A paddle tail is going to have more draw in the water. So I want to fish this, if I'm fishing a curly tail and I want a bait moving pretty quick, I'm going to go with a curly tail. I can move that faster with keeping it down in the strike zone opposed to it rising up to the surface. And I'll fish a paddle tail anytime you know, I'm in super duper shallow water, I'm casting shorelines, maybe opposed to casting towards piers. That's when I'm going to fish the paddle tail. And I do like the profile of a paddle tail a little bit better as well. So if I can get away with a paddle tail, I'm typically going to. But if I want to work it quick, I do like a curly tail. And a curly tail does really, really well having action all the time.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, it never stops moving. So if you are moving it super duper slow along the bottom, maybe after that ice just thins out, this is a good bet for you as well. As far as colors, I keep it pretty simple. If the water's dirty, I want to fish something with a decent amount of flash and glitter and maybe a little chartreuse in the tail. But I want something that's going to pop in that dirty water. And then I'll fish a lot of natural colors, like a classic pearl. And if we have one here, opening night is also one of my favorite colors. You can't go wrong with that. Super duper natural. And that's kind of it as far as paddle tails and grubs go. But you really can't go wrong with them. They're super versatile, and this is what I'm fishing maybe 90% of the time on pickerel fishing.
Yeah, and I think like with the weedless ones that you have there, just like a heavier jig head, you can kind of target areas you can't with bait. So if I was going out and saying, I really need to catch this pickerel, sure, most time I'm bringing minnows with me. There's a lot of spots I fish, though, that have pickerel where you, no matter what your bait rig is, you just really can't fish bait in those areas. So the whole weedless paddle tail is great because you get in a foot of water, lots of grass, lots of mud. You can still really get a lot of action on it and get strikes in areas that you really can't get other lures and other baits in on that kind of stuff.
Okay.
I'm going to get into some of the
Hard baits.
hard baits.
One lure that I want to, well, I guess a style of lure that I want to show you guys here. Let me get up here to the camera so you guys can see them. I'm going to say this is something kind of new, a couple years, I guess, newer, and they're glide baits. So as you guys can see, they're just like a jointed, pretty much hard bait. And this is one of my favorite lures for big fish. I mean, you're still gonna catch those smaller fish on there. You will get some bigger fish. And the reason why is the action on this bait here. The biggest key on this lure is that it doesn't have a crazy, wobble. It glides. It pretty much zigzags underneath the water. And this lure, you control it pretty much with your retrieve speed. You can go faster and it gets tighter. You can go slower and it really starts to glide on the water. Some of these lures are designed to the point where whenever you do a hard crank on the reel and then you stop it, it will actually turn and look at the fish. So we'll pretty much do that. And then a lot of times to let it drop, and those pickerel just react to it. They see it, they think it's a, bait fish that's dying. They're gonna come up and just nail it. Now there is different sizes to that. Normally I will say a 5-inch bait, which is that size. It's my go-to bait there. With that, I like to fish it when it's not too cold of a water temperature. I'm gonna say more of your early fall to early spring. And that really kind of gets me some of those bigger fish. Most of my bigger fish that, I've caught between 25 inches and plus pickerel have come on those baits. The biggest key with those baits also is matching the hatch. So knowing what, it's the main forage in the spot that you're fishing. So for most of the rivers here, yellow perch, right, Sam?
Yeah,
we got a lot of yellow perch, but we also have shad.
We have some shad.
Yeah, and we got all kinds of little stuff. So most of the time when I'm going to be fishing, or most of the colors I'm going to be getting are going to be yellow perch patterns and some of those silver colors, for kind of mimicking shad and whatnot. But the other thing you can do with these lures is actually get a little creative and start adding different hooks, like single hooks, feather hooks, just to add a little bit different, ways of actually changing the wobble in the bait. And you can play around with that. But with this stuff, one thing I'm going to tell you guys, just kind of relating to some of the gear, is they're a little bit heavier lures. Most of them are about an ounce. 5/8 to an ounce and a half. So you will have to use some heavier gear, heavier line, heavier rods for those style of baits. And like I said, going back to the same point, those lures are the ones that I'm going to use when I'm pretty much strictly going for big fish. A lot of the times when I'm mainly using that lure, I'm not catching tons of fish. I'm going for, fewer fish, but better quality size fish with those lures. They do have different sinking rates. They can go anywhere from a fast sinking to almost a floater that stays a few inches below the surface. So personally, I like a slow sinking. You can play around with the speed. You can keep it low, keep it high up in the water column. And like I said, that's just one of my newer favorite baits to kind of use for some of those bigger fish.
And one thing I want to touch on as far as glide baits go is, it's a pretty big profile as far as catching pickerel opposed to a little 4-inch bait like I throw a lot. But I think one of the reasons it works so well is in the wintertime when they don't have too much to eat, a big bait, they can eat one big bait a day and it can really keep that metabolism where it needs to be. So having one big bait, even though it looks huge, they're still going to eat it because they don't come across nearly as much bait that time of the year. And as far as colors go, I really love this gold.
Yeah.
Gold shows yellow perch super duper well. I mean, the bright fluorescent yellows and golds. So that's typically the color all fish.
Yeah.
But I do like a white too. I think that has a great time in the place. When that water is super, super dirty, I love throwing the white.
Let's hear about some of these diving
Jerk baits here. So a lot of people know these little guys here with a whole bunch of different names. Some people call them jerk baits. Some people call them plugs. Stick baits, rip baits, pretty much the same thing. But there's a couple differences, right, Sam?
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's pretty much on, besides the length, it's actually the sinking rate. You have floating,
Suspended.
and sinking. And we all have our own favorite for each spot. Like You know, if you're fishing a little bit deeper water and I'm fishing a ledge where, you know, it goes from 2 foot of water to 5 foot of water, and I really want to focus on that drop off, a lot of times I'm going to be fishing a sinking bait so I can kind of control it, keep it a little bit higher up, and once I get to the drop off, I'll stop and let it sink. But for this time of the year, suspending, that's going to be the key. And the reason why is, for me personally, is when those fish get really finicky and they follow your bait, and there's a lot of times where we'll see it if you guys have, you know, pickerel fish or any kind of fish, you can see them sometimes. They come up to the bait, they're following the bait, and they never commit to it. They just sit there. And that happens with pickerel a lot. Once, you know, we get some of these cold fronts and all that, any kind of fish will get finicky to the point where they'll follow a bait and they won't commit. So a suspending jerk bait, what it allows you to do is, if you see that happening or just the way you work it, you actually can let it sit there. You stop. You don't reel. You just let it sit there, and this bait will not sink, will not float, and it will just sit there. And a lot of times that gives time for the fish to actually sit there and look at it, and as soon as you twitch it again, boom.
That's when they commit.
They commit. They hit that lure.
I think 9 times out of 10, that's when they hit it. As soon as you pause that bait and then
Yep.
you give it that one really sharp snap, they just can't resist the bait that's sitting there completely still for anywhere from 2, and I'll leave it up to as much as 10 seconds.
Oh, yeah.
Even 15 seconds. When that water is truly freezing in the 30s, I'll snap it once, let that jerk bait sit there for 10, 15 seconds before I go back in my retrieve. And I think that's the key, is
That's
letting
the key.
that thing sit.
And that goes to the technique with jerk baits. If you never really fish in jerk bait or stick bait, whatever you want to call it, there's a little technique to it. I personally like to cast it, long distance cast, cover as much water as I can. Most of the time I'm fishing submerged grass,
Yeah.
structure, all that kind of stuff. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cast the lure long distance, crank it down, maybe a couple, 4 cranks, get it down to that water depth where it's supposed to be. And most of them will tell you how deep they will actually go with the floating and the suspending. Most of them go 2 to 4. There's a couple of deeper diving ones. So what I do, once I crank it down, I actually jerk the rod. I will do 1, 2, 3, don't pick up the slack. And that's when I let it sit there. I wait there and I count in my head. And usually what I want to do is play around with how long you let it sit there. A lot of times I'll start off with a 4 count. Jerk, jerk, jerk. 1, 2, 3, 4. Give it another couple jerks. 1, 2, 3, 4. Another 4 count. Pick up the slack. And then sometimes I mix it up where I just crank it in a few feet and start doing that again. And a lot of times you start to pick it up where, okay, if you get a hit and you let the bait sit there for 4 seconds, now you know that that's something they like, something that they're picking up. They wanted, they're sitting there for 4 seconds, and you'll start to notice that. Sometimes you just got to play around until you get the one hit, and then try to remember how long you let that bait sit there, because that's going to tell you the whole key for that day. If they're super sluggish, sometimes, like Sammy said, it takes 10, 15 seconds. Sometimes as soon as you crank it in, they're just hitting it. At that point, you don't even have to let it sit there. It's going to be one of those days where those fish are a little bit more active.
One other thing I want to touch on jerk baits is, like you said, you have your sinking, your floating, and suspending. And 99% of the time when that water is truly, truly cold, you want to fish a suspending one. But when we have, late fall time, I really like a sinking one with a really bright finish, or not so much bright, but a chrome shad pattern, because most of that shad will die.
Yep.
And when that shad is dying, it's sinking. So late fall time, typically I guess that'd be end of November, early December. I like a sinking one because I can cast it out there and really mimic how that bait is dying. And you're going to be working a little bit quicker, but you're matching the hatch, and you really can't go wrong with a simple jerk bait like that.
Sometimes you can never get too aggressive with that snap.
Yeah.
That's one thing
worry
that
about
don't be afraid of actually looking silly sometimes and sitting there and doing that, because some of those baits, and some baits are different than others. Some baits will actually zigzag better than others, than different manufacturers, but that key is, getting that clue of how long you gotta let it sit there or how fast you gotta actually whip that rod.
Yeah.
So let's move on to spinner baits. So probably the top actual baits are really going to be your plastics and your spinner baits. So if the whole goal is to catch as many fish as possible, you're probably fishing plastics and spinners. Spinners a lot of times are really just based on can you fish it. A lot of times they have trebles on the back, they get caught up pretty easily, so you really have to have the right areas. Most of us know the MEPS. Number 2, number 3, number 4, I think we all kind of prefer number 3 over the 2s for the most part. They work great. We love the feathered ones as well. Also like the Vibrex that Blue Fox makes. So they make glow-in-the-dark ones. Just a lot of better color patterns from them. Straight cast and retrieve, though, you can add a little action, but it's almost a better finding lure as well.
Right.
You know, if you're going to work a long area of shore, it's easy to find where those fish are by fishing spinners, as opposed to some of these other baits that you really have to work an area longer. There are also a lot of other options with spinners. So spinners have evolved and they keep adding plastics and this and that. So we sell a lot of this stuff for snakehead lures, but this kind of covers this whole thing of you need certain water to fish spinners. You really want to throw them though in these shallow areas and in these grasses. So MEPS has this Comet Minnow combo. And you might be able to see it there. There's a little pin here. So basically you're able to rig this curl tail weedless and still get the action of a spinner. It works really well. We actually rig these up ourselves. This is a Boone spinner on top of it, and we'll do a weedless plastic on this. So again, you can basically throw it anywhere, even though it's a big lure that sinks. The spinner gets a ton of action, the tail gets a ton of action. We fished a lot of these this fall, the different types of these, and they really were very effective. They worked as well as any other spinner or anything. Really do like those as well for those. So I think that kind of sums up, those 4 categories really are, there are a few other lures I don't think we talked about. Weedless spoons,
that's
just
my
for,
favorite one there.
That's,
The
you
silver
didn't even
minnow.
talk about it.
Well, before we move on to spoon, let me talk about one more thing here with the inline spinners. And you'll see with every one we have up here, they have some sort of hair or skirt material, and that is super important because that pulsates and it mimics, like gill plates, a shed, the scales falling off. Anytime you can have a lure that pulsates is super ideal. So the bucktail does a great job of that. It's a little bit more slower, methodical. Skirts are going to be a little bit more aggressive. So definitely don't look past that. But everything we have up here, besides a curly tail, which has more of a baitfish profile.
What I like to say is, when in doubt, throw a MEPS. And not just for pickerel, for any kind of fish. I always tell people that, when in doubt, throw a MEPS.
Why don't you head over to the TV?
Okay.
All right, so we're going to talk about some spots here. So Sam would like to give up some spots to you right now. That you no longer want to fish. No.
Now, this is a great one. This is really close to us, the Yance River. I don't know how to pronounce it.
Yeah, we're on the Severn. We're on the upper Severn right now.
Yeah. So it's the upper Severn, and a few things I'm looking for, unless I'm fishing an upper part of a river. So if I'm fishing the upper Magathie or the upper Severn, those are all great areas alone. But the creeks are primarily where I'm targeting, because when you talk about the upper Magathie is somewhat heavily pressured. But as far as the creeks go, you can't go wrong with the creeks in that upper half of the river. Most of those creeks off of there are going to hold some steady population of pickerel. These have a lot of great things going on. Number one that I look for is a choke point. This is it's so shallow right here that it acts as a choke point because there's so much current being pushed through a small area. This is a great little piece here, and then this point here in particular has a drop off, and that's a great spot as well. Anytime you have a drop off, you're going to have fish stacked up there, especially on that lower tide. They're going to sit right underneath there. But in particular, up here, there's a lot of shoreline cover, which is primarily where I'm fishing. I'm usually casting towards shoreline with some sort of plastics or something. So anytime you can have a lot of things like that, shoreline with heavy wooded cover that is close to deep cover or deep water, that's going to be a good spot. This one here and this whole particular creek has just been really good to me over the past couple of years. I've done great.
Yeah, and you usually don't catch a ton of pickerel off of one spot. So creeks like this that have all of these, like he's saying, different choke points, but just different coves. You can tell the way these docks are. You're going to be able to fish most of this creek, and you're probably going to catch pickerel throughout it. So, you're not going to catch 12 fish here, but you may catch 3 or 4 here and one here and here and here. So having those places, especially if you're in a john boat, kayak, that sort of thing, you know, you can't be just bopping from creek to creek. You know, you can't be paddling miles. So things like that where you can have a chance to catch those many fish are really great.
And one more thing up here in this creek, if you could zoom back in, right off of here, this is a really small flat, or not a small flat, it's actually a pretty large flat. It's like 3 to 5 feet, at least it was last year, as far as the depth there, but 3 to 5 feet in that range there, and it has a lot of submerged vegetation. And that's an ideal spot for me to throw a jerk bait because I can snap that and it'll even get hung up in the grass. And typically you wouldn't think you would want that, but when you snap it through a grass, it's really natural as far as a fish, you know, swimming out through a grass. So that is a really good little flat there.
Question.
Yes.
What's the, is Smith the only put-in point for the Severn down that way?
I believe so. That's typically where I put it.
Beg pardon?
Yeah. I don't know.
And they're
There's
closed
plenty
this
of
time of
private.
year. They don't have any parking.
Unless you have access to that, the boat ramps on Arden somehow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's private.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a tough one to fish. This here is Cypress Creek right here on the Magathie. This is a great little piece. This is my favorite stretch of it here when it heads off and veers up to the right side. And this is a great place. You'll see this big bend here is another sort of you know, choke point as far as a lot of current pushing through there. And this is so thick wood cover along the bank. Most of the time I'm up here, I'm just throwing towards the shoreline. But this whole entire creek, I can work that whole creek and consistently be in fishable waters. So this is one of my favorites. And it also, you know, when I talk about casting towards shoreline, I don't like really short flats. You know, if I have a flat that's 3 to 5 feet, I'll fish that. But when I'm fishing shoreline, I need to be close to deep water because when that tide comes out, you know, these fish are just as tidal as rockfish. When that tide shuts down, it's really hard to get a bite. But when you have low tide, they'll slip out onto those deeper pieces, you know. And when I say deeper, I'm probably talking as shallow as 6 to 8 feet, but I consider that deep. So if you have shoreline, you're casting into 2, 3, 4 feet of water, and then you have a drop off into that 6 to 8 foot range. That's typically going to be a good spot for me to target.
And you can put it at the Dunkin' Donuts here.
But you can get your coffee.
Yes, you can.
Can't forget that in the morning.
All right, so now we're heading up the Magathie.
So this is a spot I think most of you guys would recognize. This is the upper Magathie. Here's Magathie Bridge Road. You have the bridge here. And the reason I pointed this spot out is because you can fish from shore here. You can't park on the actual, if you pull off on the bridge itself, you can walk down underneath there and fish for pickerel. And this is a great choke point like I'm talking about earlier. But this here is a really shallow flat. If you just wait around here, there's a little spot you can fish on this side, and I'll get to that. But this in particular is a flat there, and it's about 3 to 4 feet. And I've caught so many fish there just casting jerk baits through there. And that's an amazing spot there, especially from shore. There's not too much access as far as on the western side for shore access for pickerel fishing.
Yeah, and that's one of those places, although it's not really marked as a launch or
Yeah.
this and that, like I've dragged kayaks and
Yeah.
stuff down in there. I think I've dragged john boats down there. It's not really that fun, but it
No.
works, and and even heading up farther down the
Yeah.
stream, there's a lot of good fishing throughout that
Yeah.
throughout that area there. So Alex.
All right.
So Alex is going to take us over to the eastern shore.
Any questions so far while they're working on that?
Millsboro.
All right.
Around that bridge area is good for yellow perch.
Yellow perch is great on there because right around that bend's Beechwood Park. That's a really good spot there for yellow perch, but I find they don't really stage up. They don't stay there too long. I don't catch too many off of that bridge there, but if you could get out where I was showing, you saw that flat there. If you fish, if you can wade in there, it's only like 2 or 3 feet. Cast out. I guess when you're coming out of the creek, that's a good spot. I've caught some yellow perch. They'll actually stage up there before they get that initial push up.
The nice part about that place too, just because of the way the river works, is the spawns last a lot longer there. You
Yeah.
usually get a lot longer period for yellow and white perch there. They'll come in little waves for a lot longer than they will at a lot of other spots.
When does that
What are some of
spawn
the-
start?
I'm sorry?
When does the spawn start?
So, for all we know, it could be like right now based on water temperature. I feel like a lot of years it's been earlier than people think.
Yeah.
So, we usually think late February, early March for all this stuff to start. The yellow perch will come first. But I think in the past few years we've had a lot of warmer winters, and late January has been really good. It's just sheerly who's out there to tell us, hey, the perch are here. Because if I go bang them up, you know, a lot of your first thought isn't, let me tell everybody about this. And, you know, well, no one knows, because those places like Beechwood, once everybody knows,
Yeah.
they fill up quick,
Yeah.
and there are people everywhere. So, no, I mean, I think we're all planning on fishing like in the next few days
I'm
and
going tomorrow.
kind of seeing what's
Yeah,
happening
I'm going
out there. The pickerel fishing's been good.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's been great.
But the yeah,
Great season.
so I would say any time now.
Yes, sir.
I've had a good look fishing across from, I'm not sure where it is on the map, but in Arundel Community College, the Magothy right there.
Yeah.
And I did fly fishing, black clousers, up in falling down trees in the water, and tearing up some pickerel with that setup.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Absolutely.
that's a great spot too.
Alrighty, guys. So now we're switching gears to actual ponds, lakes. Pretty much what I do most of my fishing, so a little bit more different. Tidal pickerel fishing, it's a lot different than in a couple ways than fishing actual ponds and lakes. So this is actually one of my secret actually my favorite spots to fish for pickerel, and this is in Delaware. So you do have to drive a little bit to get there, but if you're going to drive there, it's actually an amazing pickerel fishery there. And this is Millsboro Pond in Millsboro, Delaware. Of course, you do need a Delaware license to get there, but this was a classic pickerel spot. And yes, a lot of people complain about pickerel there because there's so many of them, literally. But so, just like a typical, kind of bass fishery, pond, lake, you want to look for points, you want to look for grass flats, you want to look for cover. So what I'm doing on each one of these ponds is one, finding the grass flats that are going to be between pretty much 5 to 3 foot of water. Any kind of, what is it, hydrilla, whatever kind of grass you have in that pond, you want to find it. Besides that, stumps, wood, any kind of cover, rocks. That's what you're looking for in most of these places. Now, in this pond here, you can see there's a couple islands here. There's one big one here, and then there's like 2 right here. Now, one of the places where I actually like to fish in here, and the reason why is I like to go in between those 2. And the reason why, relating to what Sammy was saying, is because on the right side, there's a channel. It goes 6 foot of water, and then it goes straight to this flat right on that right side of the islands there, where it goes to 3 foot of water, and it stays that way all the way until you get to this other shoreline here. But besides that, there is a lot of pieces of wood, there's grass, there's everything. So those are ambush places for the pickerel in the ponds where they're gonna sit there. So a lot of times when it's a sunny day, overcast, that's the primary point I'm gonna be fishing, because a lot of those fish in the ponds, I'm not gonna say they school up, but they are going to be in that same general area because they can't go anywhere. So what I'm gonna be doing is, the first thing I do when I get to some of these spots is I'm gonna use a lot of search baits, spinners, plastics, spoons. I'm trying to cover as much water as I can the fastest as possible to get an idea of an area where they're gonna be. So you gotta find the spot within the spot. That's pretty much what you're gonna do. And a lot of these ponds, some of them are small, some of them are big, and you can cover water pretty quickly, so you get an idea of where they're gonna be. So a lot of times, that middle area there, that flat's gonna be my primary point to go and look for them. Secondary point is gonna be that bend right up here. The reason why is, once again, there's a channel, there's a lot of grass, and it's a choke point there, like Sammy was mentioning. Same, that information translates to here, where a lot of those fish, there's current coming from here, it will move some of that bait fish over, and those fish will sit right on that point there, where they're gonna sit there and ambush all kinds of little yellow perch that live in that pond, bluegills, any kind of panfish, and they do have shad in this pond. So in this pond, that's how I knew I'm gonna be using shad pattern baits and yellow perch. and just kind of go back and forth between those. If you do get a couple days where it does get a little cold, and pickerel are a cold water fish, but sometimes they do like to move a little bit deeper in some of the ponds. I found that over the past few years. That's where I moved to the front of the pond, where it's a lot deeper. That pond actually gets about 15 foot of water on the front part, and that's where I'm going to be actually fishing the shorelines, because they are pretty much a nice like in a couple, I'm going to say like 10 feet out, it drops to about 10 foot of water. So I'm going to be fishing that primary, first 10 feet off the shoreline out. And a lot of times those fish will sit there and just move in and out from cold, deep to shallow water there. Now the second spot I want to go over, it's going to be in, it's going to be Johnson's Pond, and that is going to be yeah. So that is one of the classic lakes, ponds on the eastern shore. That is actually where the state record fish, pickerel, was caught a few years ago, too. And every time I go there, I catch a big old pickerel there. I mean, there is monsters. If you wanted to go to a place where you can potentially catch another state record, that is the place to go. Now, this place here, it's hit or miss sometimes.
It's either on or off.
Yeah, it's kind of like hit or miss. There's days when you can go there and catch 20, 30 pickerel, and there's days where you go there and you catch one fish, and it pretty much kind of becomes a thing where a lot of those places are going to be based on temperature, based on finding bait. One thing I like about Johnson's Pond is that it kind of comes down to actually finding the schools of shad. If you are on a kayak or a boat there, and you go in there and you can use your fancy side skin stuff nowadays, and you can find those schools of shad in semi-shallow water between 5 and 7 foot of water. That's where I'm throwing those big live baits. As soon as I find out where those schools of bait are, I'm throwing those baits right next to that ball of shad. And that's where those big pickerel are pretty much going to be hanging around, just going at it and eating those shad. I mean, I've seen a couple pickerel there up to 30 inches personally, and they get big in there. Other than that, minnows are like the secondary thing there. When you're not catching anything there with lures, it's just about drifting minnows throughout the middle there, and sometimes it's the most random spots, because you can be in 5 foot of water, 6 foot of water with a minnow out there, and they just come up and hit it.
Yeah,
But
that's a weird spot over there. It
Yeah.
really is. But when it's on fire, it's
And those spots are, like I said, some of my top secret spots to actually go for those big pickerel there.
Yeah. So a little more local and known, if you don't want to drive an hour and a half. Tuckahoe State Park is actually a really good place. I mean, there's a lot of species of fish in the pond there, but there are plenty of pickerel there, probably underfished for pickerel. A lot of different access areas. You can fish a lot of the shoreline. They have a spillway here, which is where most people end up fishing, but that's an easy spot to get to. There's also a lot of tidal water around there, because you can fish the actual Tuckahoe down in Hillsborough. So it also gives you the ability to kind of hop over to some other places. It's definitely a bigger pond than it
And
looks.
this is where you want to fish right here, honestly. For me personally, like, I fish this a lot too. And the spot is the little choke point here where the creeks kind of meet that area there, because everything's just flowing out those creeks. And you have that current, and that's going to be one of those good areas.
It holds a lot of big bass too.
Yeah.
Don't
So,
think- don't
especially for the winter time.
The big
I've seen
bass.
some
big ones in
big
there.
crappie come out of there.
Yeah.
as well.
Can you get a boat in those ponds?
Yeah.
There's a launch
All
on
of
that
those,
one.
the Delaware one, you can use a gas power. Johnson's one, you can use a gas power. I think that they're restricted to certain sizes in Delaware. Johnson's, I don't think there is, but you can put a boat there and a kayak. Same thing for Tuckahoe there.
There's some advantages with fishing some of these real back creeks in the wintertime with the heavy winds. If you're like, I fished out of a canoe, and not to be blown around, that's a long day,
Yeah.
and the wind's got a hold of you. So some of these open ponds are, if it's windy, maybe not so much, and then you get some trees to protect you, maybe
Right.
down in a spot. It's a nicer day of
Oh yeah, and
targeting.
sometimes, like me being on a kayak, a lot of times what
Yeah,
I
man.
do is actually, sometimes I like the windy days, and let me tell you why. Because if you do find a cove, and let's say it has an opening, and the wind is actually making current,
Driving,
pushing
yeah.
you, driving, bait fish and whatnot,
Right.
I try to take a little anchor or something and then anchor up on that point. And all I'm doing is actually spending some time and just fishing there on that, pretty much on that break point between the wind and the calm water. And sometimes those fish just like to hang right there, and it's pretty much like current because it's creating some movement on the water there.
Right, and that wind's driving all your bait, and that's
Mhm.
kind of.
A lot of times it sucks, but you do want to fish the windy banks where it's, you know, getting stirred up and everything's getting pushed to that area. And the reason why, like we just said, it's bait fish being pushed there. Those fish know it, they're gonna sit there. And yeah, sometimes, you know, it gets cold and all of that, but that's what you wanna do. You wanna fish those banks where it's kinda, you know, you're getting a little beat up, but
There's some spots where in the summertime I fished these ponds that have duckweed on them.
Mhm.
And it's super nice where the duckweed actually gets blown to one side of the pond, gets heavy, and you can actually fish your frogs and things and find some spots where
Right.
you're maybe a top pop with a pork rind that
Yeah.
can fall through. And
yeah, it translates to everything. You know,
It does.
every kind of fishing is gonna be the same way, so.
What I'm saying is if it wasn't stacked up from the wind, you wouldn't be able to skip across it. You get hung up in it.
Right.
Whereas it being so heavy, you can actually walk and find the spots and drop
Right.
through. Yeah.
All right, so I think that wraps up our pickerel portion of this.
Yeah.
We're going to move right on to perch, and we want to get into actually talking about some lures and rigs and stuff. So, just starting again with bait fishing, just like we did with pickerel. So, you know, we're really talking about the perch run. We're not talking about summer perch, fall perch. We're really talking about these spawning runs, targeting for the spawning runs. And there's really two kind of places or ways you're targeting them. So right now, if they're not already spawning, they're staging to spawn, and they're going to be in deeper holes, a little bit more at the headwaters of the creeks or the rivers, in the rivers like that. Some of that fishing can be phenomenal because you're not getting them strung out swimming up creek. They're literally in huge, bigger schools off of structure and whatnot.
You can catch hundreds.
You can, and sometimes the most simplest rigs work in those type of scenarios and whatnot. So our main baits are going to generally be grass shrimp and minnow. So minnows again are going to be great. Grass shrimp are going to be great. There's tons of different stuff. Bloodworms, night crawlers, all of it works. As we talked about with search baits, so a big part of the perch run is, are they running, where are they running, and the one thing we want to do as quickly as possible is say, are they here or not? So if possible, I will generally fish grass shrimp, whether I plan on fishing lures all day, whether I plan on fishing minnows all day. I'm going to usually fish grass shrimp, probably under a bobber on a rig, on just a little shad dart rig, right underneath a bobber, maybe 18 inches down, something like that, or a tandem rig. I usually always go with tandem rigs that time of year. So I'll usually do a shad dart tandem rig, or like I talked about before, I'll drop a smaller spoon, which would be like this number 12 Tony spoon off the back, and I'll do a grass shrimp on the bottom shad dart, trail this off the back with a minnow. Just like with anything else, the bigger bait usually catches the bigger fish. So once I've actually targeted and I've said, okay, there are perch here, I'm going to only fish minnows. Because when these fish are schooling up, usually the smaller fish gets to the bait first. So if I sit there and fish grass shrimp all day, I may catch perch all day, but maybe they're 9, 10 inches.
Yeah.
I switch to minnow, maybe I'm not catching quite as many, but I'm getting that 11 and 12 incher here and there. So love a small spoon, a small Tony 12 spoon with a minnow on that, or these tandem rigs that we talked about there. So again, they're going to be in all kinds of water, and when they actually run, you're really looking for holes. So same thing we talked about with pickerel, there are choke points, there are a lot of different areas, but you're really looking for these little holes that they're going to kind of, you have the tide running, they're going to swim off, and they're going to kind of just sit there for a minute. When you find those holes, I mean, I've had tons and tons that I've hit over and over, and you can catch 100 fish in a day, and they just keep coming to those little spots. You're a foot to the left, foot to the right, you don't catch them. So so that's really what you're trying to do, is find those. Back to just the deeper water stuff, because those holes can be in deeper water even when they are running up creek. This is just a heavy-duty top and bottom rig with some flicker spinners. I specifically pulled this rig out because I think I fished one day at Hillsboro next to a guy, and I had all these fancy rigs and this and that, and he had like a 2-ounce sinker on here, and he was just throwing this thing on there, and just literally those spinners straight on the bottom with a piece of night crawler were creaming fish. So So different attacks on how you get your bait down there, how your bait's being shown. I think it's all valid. You know, just saying that, you know, we would always tell you, hey, use fluorocarbon leaders and these finesse baits and this and that. There are times and places where these sort of rigs do just work really well. And a lot of like a rig like this is the tide's moving well, that spinner's going, and again, you set this thing right in that hole, you're gonna load up on fish. So it doesn't have to be the fanciest thing in the world, and sometimes things like that do work really, really well. A lot of different things as well as opposed. So we fish a lot of things under bobbers. So a lot of times it is just a shad dart, but I know we'll all mix it up with little dressed jig heads like this, little types of spinners and things like that. One of the favorites of the store are these little hot skirts that VMC has. They've got great little hooks on them, great color patterns, a lot of flash, and a lot of times if the perch are in thick, you can actually just move off a bait altogether, and you can just jig those little flash jigs, which is really nice. Another thing too is probably underfished overall. A lot of people know about fish bites for bottom fishing. Usually don't work too well this time of year. The water's not warm enough for the scent to disperse. But the little curl tails, and what do they call these little
like minnows,
little shads? These are 2 or 3 inch plastics that'll rig right on a shad dart or any of these jigs. And this Gulp Alive scent really works well. So it's a great alternative. There are very few times when I'll fish this time of year that I won't at least have this available or in the boat, just because it does work so well. Anyway, you have anything else on the bait stuff you guys wanted to talk about?
On the bait, I think we're all set there.
Yep. And usually on these too, just if you're rigging these, so we do sell a lot of these tandem rigs. We sell these already pre-rigged. Usually we're using anywhere from like 8 to 10 pound fluorocarbon. Very, very small 3-way swivel, just because it's easy and it helps keep it from tangling. And doing about a, 6 to 8 inch drop followed by a 12 to 18 inch drop to make those tandem rigs.
Yeah.
Anytime you can fish those, it's usually going to work well.
One other thing I want to add to that is with some of the jigs or flies, flies pretty much, small, tiny flies, especially when the run is going on and those fish are pushing up way up in the creeks, and your actual deep hole is going to be about 2 to 3, 4 foot of water. Just a small tiny bobber and a little fly, and just throw it out and let it float down, and we'll catch most of your fish that way. The most natural way, and that's kind of like mixing up your fly fishing with regular conventional spinning gear. That way, if you don't know how to fly fish or do any of that, you'll actually produce a lot of fish. And same thing, match what they're eating. A lot of times, just a little grass shrimp looking fly will pull most of your fish all day long when you get up in that late spawn time of the year in the spring. Anything else you guys?
Nope. So we're gonna move on to some lures. Sam, we can talk about some plastics here.
So as far as plastic goes, we sell a multitude of options. As far as really tiny baits, that 1 inch to maximum of really 3 inch size. Over the last few years, busting bait stingers have by far become the most popular. There's so many companies rigging things with them, but here's just a really good example of what I most of the time will do if I'm fishing artificial. Is I'll take 2 small jigs and I'll just tie them on a simple tandem like we have with the somewhere over here, just like I have on this Marabou one with these 2 Marabou jigs. A simple tandem rig is always a good bet, and I think with white, or particular yellow perch, color just seems to be really important sometimes. I've noticed that specifically with yellow perch, and you have to have a few colors with you, but I think a classic white is always an amazing option.
Right.
The other ones on the bustin' baits that are really popular color-wise, white is always going to be good. They call this, I think, grass shrimp.
Yeah.
This is a really good color, and then the orange, which we don't have in stock right now, is also a really good option. As he said, those are some of the best ones. We also have some new plastics. These just came out, and they look really good, especially for reaction bite. These are Mr. Crappie little split tail, what do they call them? Snapjacks. Haven't fished these yet, but they look like, again, for those quick snaps, get a reaction bite, be a great bait.
Anytime you're fishing quick or when that water starts to warm up, especially as we're getting into a full-blown spawn, rigging these on a simple little 1/32, 1/16 ounce jig head. And these things have a ton of action. What you can't see here in the video, I'm sure, they have these flanges like Strike King has been doing for years. They just really are going to thump away.
And most of the time, we are fishing those under a bobber.
Yep, a lot of time under a bobber.
Yeah, and really, I feel like the bobber is more dependent on if you feel like you can get away without
Right.
using a bobber, I'm not going to use a bobber, but
Yeah.
that's all based on how much I feel like I'm going to tangle with things.
Yeah, it matters. You know, it depends more like we were saying, if you found a fish or not. Like I personally, if you already know a deep hole that's holding a lot of fish, I'm one of those guys that I don't like to use a bobber, and I actually like to just. It kind of relates to rockfish jigging in a way. You throw out your either 1/16 of an ounce with 4-pound, 2-pound test line, let it drop, and you're kind of targeting that bottom, and you just snap, follow the current snap, and it becomes more of a feel with your rod. I know me and my buddy the last few years have been doing that a lot, and a lot of times it produces a lot of fish just kind of snap jigging on the bottom with those little tiny jigs. Of course, you're downsizing your whole gear with that. Another prime example is when I'm fishing deeper water and you found like suspended fish or you found fish on the bottom. The tandem rig that Sammy rigged up there is one of my favorite, and you just sit there, and if you're fishing current, I like to throw it up current and just let it kind of follow down with the current and just snap it on the way down, and once you hit the bottom, and that produces a decent amount of fish that way.
Don't want to talk too much about it, but spinners always are an option. Definitely more of a summer lure. I rarely break a spinner out. I don't know why, it just doesn't seem to do that well on the perch rod. Although I will say I've used some of these lighter perch pounders, 1/8 ounce, and tipped them with minnows, and that does work really well. Heavy current, where that's going to spin all by itself, you can almost drop it down and just kind of, without even retrieving, just let the minnow and the spinner do its job there.
One more thing we're going to go back to as far as staging yellow perch, something we forgot to put up here, but like a Cast Masters, when you see that school in the electronics most of the time when you're in the staging area, which is going to be at the mouth of a creek or sometimes the mouth of a river even, in that deeper water, a 3/8 ounce Cast Master jigging right over top of them is my go-to for that situation.
Yeah, and we didn't bring sabikis out. Those are obviously another good option. I have the oversized bottom rig, but that's essentially a sabiki rig, which is just a mono or fluorocarbon leader with 2 little teasers. They're either shrimp or feathered, and you can just jig those like that. The only other hard bait, or bait really I think worth talking about probably, are just like with the pickerel, just your suspending baits like this. So, the spinners you really do generally have to retrieve quickly. This you do not. It's going to go as deep as you pull it. So it's something that you can retrieve at different speeds, different depths that work really well. Particularly these Rapala ultralights are great. They come in this natural color, and I think we have like a fire tiger color that really does work really well.
All right, let's go to the spots.
To the
Show
spots.
you where to catch the fish.
Where do you want to catch the fish
Yes,
at?
sir.
I was thinking too, maybe to add to avoid a mistake. A lot of people are using braid these days, and you guys are this time of year in the winter. The water gets super clear, so
Yeah.
leaders.
Yeah, and we're gonna touch on that on the gear side there.
Okay, cool,
Go over
yeah.
the whole, fluoro, mono, braid. I know
Blue
everybody-
dots. for your action.
Yeah, everybody has their own little preference and whatnot, and some techniques do better, with certain lines than others.
Where do you want to go?
I'm gonna show you another 4-way spot because it's an awesome spot.
It's an awesome spot.
And I mean it. It's most of these spots here are gonna be.
Oh
When I said I was giving out secret spot, I meant it.
So we are at Snow Hill, just
So-
south of
I
Salisbury.
just went out. It's not on the screen.
Down.
No, I mean it's not
Yeah,
showing
it's still
up.
showing the
Yeah.
All right, so this area right here, it's actually one of my favorite areas for this time of the year right now. And there's a reason why. Usually in the Pocomoke River, the yellow perch spawn starts a little bit earlier than most of the spots up here. So if you're willing to make a little bit of a drive and maybe even go camping, because there is some campgrounds down there and you can fish, you can camp there and fish for the weekend and whatnot. It's a great area here for all kinds of fishing. I mean, you can catch bass, pickerel, yellow perch, crappie, everything pretty much. Great spot. It's one of my favorite places to fish in the state, period. So I'm gonna go over this right here, and there is some short spots that you can short fish here, but most of them are going to be, boat or kayak access only. So this is Snow Hill. There is 2 boat ramps right on the center here, where you can launch your boat, short fish, do all that kind of stuff. And right off the bat, right in front of the actual boat ramp here, there's going to be right off the boat ramp right here. You can see there's a couple islands here. Now, most of these cuts here are super shallow, and when I mean super shallow, you're hitting pretty much 1 foot, 2 foot of water in a lot of these areas. So most of your fishing is going to be right off the actual river itself. And I believe the Pocomoke River is one of the deepest by average, because it does stay pretty deep in the middle, which makes it actually easier to find those yellow perch. And that is just fishing off the point. So every kind of little point you're going to see here where it goes from shallower water to deep water, they're just going to stack there. They're going to school up, they're going to sit there, and most of the time they just switch sides depending on the tide, because it is a tidal river. So if the tide's coming out, they're going to sit on that back side. If the tide's coming up, they're going to sit on that upper part of those points. And those fish just move up and down from there. So a lot of the techniques I like to use in a lot of these areas here is actually just throwing out a bobber into the shallow water with a minnow, and then just kind of dragging it out to the drop off. A lot of times you kind of start to notice as soon as that bait gets right on the drop off, they just hit it. Once I find those fish in a little bit deeper water, which is 5 to 7 foot of water where they're suspended, I like to just kind of jig, just pretty much vertical jig over top of them. That tandem rig would show you that's going to be the perfect lure for that. You can drift over top of them, you can anchor on that point and just sit there, throw it out, and just slowly jig it up and down. And you don't necessarily have to let it hit the bottom. You can let it, drop a few seconds and then just start to do that, and you start to notice where those fish are on the water column. If you, let it drop to the bottom and you start getting hits on the bottom, they're going to be obviously on the bottom. If they hit it on the way down, which happens a lot, they're going to be suspended, and then you can kind of get that idea. But it's going to be a great crappie, yellow perch and white perch spot for that area there. And just to kind of show you guys here, besides the little spot there, is if you ever take a guide or actually venture down there, every little elbow has a shallow end going up the river. That's where you want to be. Like I mentioned, you can clearly see that that's a point there. Every single little elbow will have fish sitting in there. And you never know what you're going to catch there. A lot of times I'm catching a mix of yellow perch. A lot of times I'm catching crappie, white perch, and your occasional bass and pickerel there. And just to mention, this is also one of the places where they catch some monster pickerel just by bycatch when they're fishing for yellow perch there.
Yeah, like you said, when you go to the Pocomoke, you are not just going to catch perch. You are going to catch a multitude of species. There is literally everything freshwater, brackish water fish you can think of, you can find in that river. It's amazing.
Now a couple spots closer to home here.
Yeah, so just real quick, so down here you're going to see the Choptank River just south of Tillman Island. It's basically the largest funnel for yellow and white perch in our general area, maybe in all of Maryland. It is the biggest funnel that pushes these fish in large numbers. So a lot of the spots that you hear about or have fished, haven't fished, are going to be Hillsborough, Greensboro, Red Bridges. All of those the Choptank flows into, and the Choptank goes, that's where it's going to head up to. The nice part about those spots is they're all places that you really could technically hit all in one day. So if one place isn't hitting, you can go to another. They both have good yellow perch runs. They both have good white perch runs. First place we'll talk about is Hillsborough, because that's going to be the first one you're going to pass, and that's right off of 404. It's an easy place to park at and fish off the land, but it also has a ramp. Where am I at? But it also has a ramp to put your boat in.
Yeah, the ramp's just right there, just south of the bridge. You can see it right there. So that's a ramp there if you want to launch a boat. Most people will actually park right there on the shore, like right there on the shoreline there, and that's a great spot because, like Mike said, just funnels through there, little choke point. Deeper spot to fish off
There's
the
the-
actual bridge there, and also the boat ramp
Yeah,
there.
that's the right here. That's the spot there. Yeah, and just like he said with the other area, it's the best part about Hillsborough is it is a steep drop.
Yeah.
If you go north, if you put it in past the railroad, it gets very, very shallow. But you get a lot of great tidal movement, and when it's on at Hillsborough, it's on, and everybody's catching fish. So that's the first good spot there. So if we head over, this is probably one of my favorite spots. So you go a little farther and head up to Greensboro. This also has a lot of great spots to fish from shore, as well as putting a kayak or a boat in there. So, where's the main park here? Is this the park?
Yep, that's the part there.
Yeah,
Boat ramp
so-
through there.
So right here, this is the main boat ramp here. They do a lot of bass tournaments out of here. Almost everything in the perch, I shouldn't say almost, but usually the better perch fishing is north of that, although I have done well off of, just like he's saying, off of the elbows here and a little farther down there. Kind of when you get past that, it really opens up and it's a lot harder to target. You can also go to the next bridge right up here and park off the side and put in. That's usually where I put in. For whatever reason, this entire turn between the two bridges doesn't usually produce much. A lot of really shallow area
Super
in
shallow,
there.
yep.
Not a lot of places for them to stage. So I've done very well right here. Probably the best spot is this big turn right up here, right before it. Once you get a little bit past there, again, you can't really get a boat anywhere
No.
farther. So that's the last place they can really stage before they start pushing up to red bridges. But lots of great shoreline, lots of good area to fish. And a lot of places you can just fish from land and find your own little spots. As you head on up,
In all these areas too, don't be afraid to wade. Most of these places, it's shallow enough around the banks. You can just get in a pair of boots or knee-high waders, and you can just walk. And you can cover a lot of stuff. A lot of people don't do that there.
Yeah. Yeah, most of these spots are pretty much, you can, I like to shoreline fish better
Yeah.
than take a boat or kayak in a lot of these places, like Red Bridges, Greensboro, Hillsboro, all those areas, just because they do get super shallow where
Yeah.
sometimes you can get up if you're going up on like a high tide, but once the low tide comes down,
Yeah.
you might get stuck up in a few of these spots.
yeah,
up
so
in the upper parts.
you really only had like 10 minutes up the road to 313 to hit Red Bridges. Red Bridges is unlike the other spots. It is very small. It is the head of the headwaters, and it is tight fishing. You want
Yeah.
shorter rods there. It's a hit or miss. A lot of times I'll go there first because it's such small water. That is the ultimate. It's either happening or it's
not,
completely
yeah.
not. So
Yeah.
it's easy to just go there, throw a few lines in, and say, scrap this, go down to Greensboro. But again, when it's on, it's very, very good. So those are probably the top shore spots
Yeah.
to hit over there. But let's move on over to the western shore and talk about a couple places. So the Magathy Bridge Road place
Yeah.
we just talked about, which is what's the public access there called?
Beechwood?
Beechwood Park.
Yeah.
That's one of the better spots in the Magathy.
Yeah, and it's been even good in the past couple of weeks.
Yeah.
People have been catching fish consistently there.
Yeah.
It's been great.
And the funny thing is, apparently this year I've heard that there's been a consistent crappie bite there.
Yeah.
Like nothing crazy big, but there's crappie that I guess have either flushed down from the lake upstream, Lake Waterford, or they're being stocked by DNR somehow. But there's been actually
There's been quite a few.
a lot of crappie there recently.
There's a code off to the right of the house.
Yeah, that's where they've been tearing them up right there.
Right in that runway, I don't know how the sailboat gets in and out of there.
Yeah.
Right in that runway.
I haven't seen a
right in that
sailboat
runway,
move in
all you gotta
years.
do is
No.
cast with the tide, and if they're there, they're
Yeah.
gonna
So I know up here, up here is Magathy Bridge where we were talking about in Beechwood Park. This little point up here is kind of interesting because this is one of those places where you can get them staging, and the Magathy can be kind of difficult to find. The Magathy has so many little arms and this and that. A lot of times they just don't stage in full like they do at red bridges. Like it's
Yeah.
not. They kind of go off on these things. So you just notice how it's just really easy to see how where am I at now? Yeah, how much that splits off, and so you're going to be able to find fish here and here on the, especially times like right now. If you really take your time, get the depth finder out, you're going to probably find a lot of big groups of staging fish there. You guys have anywhere else in the Magothy or Severn River?
I have something actually down in southern Maryland, which is I think Wason's Connor or whatever. Yeah, let me. So this is on the Patuxent River, just probably about 30, 40 minutes from here, I guess. So that area right there, it's just where you're going to be using your typical bottom rigs on the bottom, fast-moving water. There is a couple elbows here and there, but that place is actually pretty cool because it's just they're in the middle there most of the time.
If you go up north on the first bend up north,
Yeah.
it's 11 foot of water, 9 foot of water there. They'll stack up in there.
Yeah, so there's a couple like elbows and stuff like that, and then this is actually an area where you can park and you can actually fish a whole shoreline there underneath the bridge and whatnot, and you can put a kayak in there too. I'm not sure of any boat ramps. I know there was one south of there, but they closed it, I think, last year. So right now it's just pretty much all kayak and some of that shoreline access. But that's one of the other spots in this western shore where, typically you start to see some of those yellow perch move up and stage there, and that's kind of like where I kind of gauge it if they're about to spawn, because you start to see them pretty heavily in there.
Yeah. So we're going to be wrapping this up soon. We've gone a little over time, so we're going to try and speed up through some of this. We'll talk about rods and combos if anybody wants to talk about them. We'll talk about that after this, just so we're not keeping everybody. But real quick run through on fishing online. So the few different options. So most of these rigs we use for perch and pickerel. One of the main reasons I feel like line is so important is casting distance. You're throwing 1/32 ounce jig heads, really lightweight stuff. A lot of times the diameter line really makes a difference. We talk about it a lot with striped bass, but you're throwing 1 ounce lures. You're usually be able to cast anywhere. So first is for people who don't like braid. There's monofilament and then there are copolymers. P-line is a copolymer. We've carried it forever. It's 20% thinner than monofilament, and it has a higher stretch ratio. So harder to break off, but also a 6 pound is kind of more like a 4 pound, and 8 is more like a 6. You'll get a little more casting distance out of it, and it's a nice limp line. Another thing, if you go to braid, there are a lot of different braids, and there's a lot of like hokey pokey things. But in general, I like to think of it as there's 4-strand braids and 8-strand braids. 4-strand braids are actually thicker. So this is regular Power Pro, and this is Spider Wire's new Ultracast. The exact same pound test line, the Ultracast is either exactly half the diameter or close to. That's a lot of distance when you really get down to it on the casting side of it. So, max distance, these 8 strands are going to be better. As we talked about, based on water clarity and certain things, monofilaments are usually things we lean toward. I generally always fish braid because I'm always fishing leaders. So as long as I have a leader, fluorocarbon mono, I'm usually not terribly worried about that color of that line getting in the way. On the fluorocarbon, on the leader stuff, monofilament or fluorocarbon's fine. We definitely prefer fluorocarbon. I'm usually in the 8 to 10 pound test area, so I'm usually fishing 4 or 6 pound mono, 6 or 8 pound leader. On the pickerel stuff, just sized up a few pounds. So maybe fishing more of the 6 to 10 pound on my reel, and then 10 to 15 pound on the leader on those things. So anyway, thank you guys all for coming out, and everybody who tuned in online. Thank you guys. I know you guys have been sitting here for a really long time. We really appreciate it, and we love talking about perch and pickerel. So please do come up because we love just chatting about it and this and that. And maybe we can pick your guys' brains on what we can go do tomorrow. So that would be great.
But if you got any more questions or anything, come up here and we can go more into in depth with some of this stuff here.
Yep.
Well, thank you guys.
Thank you. Yay.
And our next seminars are February 22nd and 29th.
Yes.
And those will both be snakehead.
Yep. And we're going to have a snakehead tasting on the 29th, so that'll be great as well.
Yeah, so come out for those for sure.
Absolutely.
It is, yeah.